So, I'm Sonia Ali, the Dyslexia and Learning Difficulties Specialist teacher, and this webinar is going to be about precision teaching. All right, so thank you for coming along. Now, we only have 2 learning aims today. So firstly, what we want to do is we want to understand the rationale behind precision teaching. Essentially, we want to have some idea of the principles of learning that underpin precision teaching. Okay. The second, and possibly most important, learning aim is that we will be confident enough to then go out and implement precision teaching in our own practice. And if you want further information, we can organise more training. And on the SENDsuccess website, on our resources page, there is a pack that will give you all the information that you get on this webinar about precision teaching. So, to begin with, I'd like to present you with a scenario that reflects a situation that we may encounter at school. So I'm going to read this to you. Robert is in year 2 and he's showing signs of dyslexia. He is still not able to blend words with phase 2 letter sounds. He's received the same phonics teaching as his classmates, but he's not keeping up. Robert tries to read by guessing many of the words on the page. He spends 15 minutes a day reading to an LSA, but he's still not making any progress in his reading. So the question here is, why is the guided reading intervention not helping? Getting all that one-to-one time doesn't make any difference. So why is that? Right, okay, thanks Nina. Perhaps a difficulty with phonological processing. Yeah, that's exactly the point. So the key thing there is that he is still not able to blend words with phase 2 letter sounds. So essentially, the intervention is not targeted enough. In order for intervention to be effective, it's got to be targeted to that student's needs. Reading for 15 minutes, even 20 minutes on a daily basis is too general and it's not cumulative. So Robert's lack of fluency stems from the fact that he can't identify and even blend simple letter sounds. And that's preventing him from reading words with those sounds. So he's kind of stuck at this early stage of reading acquisition. In order to go further and continue to learn, we need to address that most basic stage of his learning, which is to develop his fluency in identifying those and being able to blend those phase 2 letter sounds. So the key point there is fluency. So that brings me on to another task that I would like you to have a look at. I want you to try and read this slide. I'll give you about 30 seconds. And all I want you to do is to tell me if you think you've read it, if it made sense to you. Okay, so I'll give you about 30 seconds. Okay, done it. Right, so I'm assuming that most of you who read it kind of got the gist. So I'll just briefly read it to you. Even if you got 1 or 2 words that aren't quite what I'm saying to you, you got the general gist. So it says, sometimes it can take longer for some children to learn to read and write, but with patience and the right support, it will happen. It is important for teachers to learn about dyslexia, to know how to support the children they teach. So the key question is, how can you read this? Why is that possible? How is it possible for you to read something that is so different to what it should look like? And the answer is fluency. So your knowledge of word formation, word recognition, syntax, grammar is so fluent that it's become unconscious. It's an unconscious skill. And at that level, you're able to adapt your knowledge effortlessly to different scenarios. Your brain circuitry is adapting what you know to what it is presented with, and that is the strength of fluency in any skill. So fluency is a vitally important part of the learning process. It's only when you are fluent at a skill and you've maintained that fluency, say, for example, recognizing letter sounds, that you can generalize that learning in new situations, for example, reading words with those letter sounds, and then adapting that knowledge to different new situations. So, for example, in Robert's case, trying to spell a word with letter sounds. Now, many of the students who you will use precision teaching with may be dyslexic, and a lot of people have a general awareness of some of the core weaknesses of dyslexia. You may be aware that dyslexic students may have weak phonological awareness and processing skills. Obviously, we know that a weakness in core literacy skills is one of the first signs that would flag up a possible underlying SPLD. Reduced working memory capacity is something that a lot of teachers or SENCos may be aware of. But what I think people are less familiar with is that many dyslexic children simply need more time to become fluent in a skill, in particular a language-based skill. This is known as procedural memory. Procedural memory is, in a sense, the memory needed to reach a level of automaticity in a skill. Okay, so to illustrate this point, there's a figure here from a study by two well-known specialists in the field of SPLD, and they've come up with a figure to kind of reflect this. So for anyone, if acquiring a skill requires 900 repetitions, a child with dyslexia may take 30 times as many repetitions for that skill to become implicit, for them to become fluent in that skill. Okay, so the square of 900 times. So on the basis of this, we're going to summarize the key points that underpin, the key learning principles that underpin precision teaching. First is that a dyslexic pupil may need significantly more rehearsal and practice to become fluent in literacy-based skills. So overlearning is a linchpin of intervention for dyslexic pupils. And secondly, this very important element of fluency. So fluency in a skill needs to be achieved and maintained for learning to be used in real contexts. So using Robert as an example, he hasn't achieved fluency in identifying phase 2 letter sounds. And so he is not able to then or generalize his learning to what he reads. So that needs to be addressed first and foremost. Now, any questions so far on any of that? No? Okay, so this brings us on to the second part, which is, what is precision teaching? Now, the title, precision teaching, is a bit deceptive because it's not the actual teaching as such, which is the most significant feature of precision teaching. We will look at some teaching strategies later on, but actually the core feature of precision teaching is the tool that is used to measure and track fluency and how this influences the teaching. So, what is precision teaching? Precision teaching is an intervention technique created to improve a child's fluency in a skill. Now, a core feature of precision teaching is that fluency is measured after each teaching session in a timed exercise, usually a minute, using a tool called a probe. Now, don't worry if none of those things are familiar to you, because I'm going to explain it step by step for you. So, other features of precision teaching are the length of teaching session. So teaching sessions should be brief. and very short, 2 to 8 minutes max. But they need to be regular, if not twice a day, then at least daily. So the core thing is short but regular. The teaching must be very targeted. So that means you're not saying, oh, we want this person to improve their writing or we want them to get better at reading. There are very targeted and specific learning items for each teaching block. So 4 to 8 items should be taught until the student is fluent at reading or spelling. So what I mean by that is that you choose very specific targets that you want the child to learn. This could be, can read words with the following digraphs and vowel trigraphs, for example. Or you may recognise that they can't read certain high-frequency tricky words. So you will pick out 6 tricky words and they will develop their fluency in being able to read those. If you're looking at spelling, then again, you will pick out between 4 and 8 spelling words that you would like them to spell, and that will be your focus and nothing else. Okay. Now, each session, as I said before, was followed by a timed 1-minute assessment. So you teach the particular items, and then you follow that with a 1-minute assessment using a grid called a probe. And the probe is used to measure fluency. And the sessions continue until you can recognise that the student has reached their fluency aim rate. So the first thing we need to think about is, what is probes? I've been mentioning that word quite a lot. So what is it? So a probe looks something like this. On the top, you have the learning targets. So that is what we want the student to be fluent in. We want the student to be able to recognise these vowel digraphs. There are 4 vowel digraphs and 1 trigraph. There are 5 items in total. Okay. Now there's 40 words on this sheet, but actually they're not 40 different words or 40 different graphemes. It's the same 5 graphemes repeated randomly, distributed over the page. And what happens is that the pupil is expected to read as many of these as they can in 1 minute. The idea is that fluency is measured by accuracy, but also by speed. So the more fluent we become at a skill, the quicker we can perform that skill. Okay, the probe sheet looks like this. Now, if you were testing, for example, reading, you would have a copy of the probe sheet, the student would have a copy of the probe sheet, and you would mark off everything that they read correctly and cross what they read incorrectly. If you're doing a spelling assessment, the student will not have a copy of the probe sheet, obviously. You will read the words to them, and when you look at them, when they finished writing one word, then you will read out the next word, and you will then tick what they have spelt correctly. So it's slightly different depending on whether it's a reading focused exercise or a spelling exercise. Now, this continues, and you will have a number of sessions, and then the question remains, so how do we know when to stop? How do we know when a student has reached fluency with a certain skill? In other words, how many correct items in a minute indicates that that student is now fluent at that skill? Now, there isn't one particular set figure that answers this question. So it does, firstly, depend on what you're testing. So for example, if you are testing word reading, so all the student needs to do is look at their probe sheet and say what they can read or identify, then obviously a provisional aim rate is going to be larger, for example. So 35 to 40 words or items per minute would be a provisional aim rate to aim for. If, on the other hand, you're asking the student to spell a word, that could be much lower, and obviously it would depend on how quickly a student can write. So that's a much lower aim rate. And then, of course, if you're asking them to see something, if you're doing numeracy, I mean, we're focusing more on literacy, but you can use precision teaching for numeracy as well, and we'll come to that in a subsequent precision teaching webinar. Then they'll look at the sum, they'll need to complete it. Again, that will take a little bit longer. So there isn't one number. If you want to obtain a more personalised fluency aim rate, then, for example, for spelling, some students may write very quickly, others not so quickly. You can conduct, give them a probe sheet, give them a test on words that you know already they're fluent at, and see how quickly they write those words. Okay, so if they're already fluent at that particular those particular words, then you can see, well, that's roughly how many words that student will be able to write in 1 minute. So that's their fluency. Okay. Any questions so far? So we've looked at what a probe sheet is and how we would use it. And we've also thought about when we know when to stop, in a sense, and move on to new targets. So how do we know that a student is now fluent at that skill? So the next stage is the tracking phase. So as you are teaching, after every few sessions, you will chart the progress that the student makes. Okay, so to do this, we use something called acceleration chart. So acceleration chart is used to track the pupil's progress over time. So after most sessions, it doesn't have to be after each session, say after 3 sessions, you will look at acceleration chart. It looks something like this, and you will write down the number of the number of items the student read correctly and the number they have said incorrectly. And you'll plot the graph accordingly. So what will happen is, over time, you will be able to see how many that they have got incorrect and how many that they have got correct. So here is an example of the first session that a student did. So we can see that they managed to read or identify 5 of these foul digraphs in a minute, and they attempted to the trigraph, but they got that incorrect. So there's very early level of fluency there. Okay, now looking at the probe sheet, I already have some information. I know that they're not fluent yet at all, they're not near their aim rate. I also know that they have particular difficulty with I, with the tridigraph I. So this will inform my next teaching session. I'll know that I will pay particular attention to that. And over time, you will plot this. Now, the acceleration chart is useful for a number of reasons. Firstly, if you see no positive changes after 3 days, then you know you need to change something in your teaching. So you will maybe need to reduce the number of target words or numbers that you're expecting the child to learn. Even if you reduce it down to 2 items, that's fine. The objective is not the quantity, it's about reaching fluency. If an aim rate is not met after 4 weeks, again, you may consider reducing the target words and numbers. And of course, the probe sheets, it's important to look at your probe sheets after each session, because the errors will inform teaching for next session. So look at what the child got wrong. Did they consistently get the same item wrong? Do they get stuck with one particular sound? So use the probe sheet to inform what you focus on in the next session. And you can complete the acceleration chart either as I've done there, or you can even do it as a bar chart. Okay, so you can colour in what is incorrect in one colour, what's correct in another colour. Okay. Now, key points then. If a student makes more errors than not over 3 days, then those targets need to be broken down. Do not persevere, because it won't do the student's confidence any good. Don't be afraid to adapt the learning and the targets. So if a student's not making much progress, reduce down the number of items that you want them to learn, okay, until we start seeing that they're making progress and the errors are going down and the number correct are going up over time. So, this is possibly the most important detail. So how do we generate a probe sheet and where do we find acceleration chart? No one is expecting you to write out probe sheets every session and to create your own acceleration chart. Everything can be done very easily on this wonderful website. So you go there. It's very simple to use. You can generate the probe sheets just by inputting the items you want the student to learn, and it will randomly populate a grid for you. And also you have an example of the grids that I showed you for you to have a look at. So it's very easy to use. Now, any questions? So, as an overview so far of the steps of precision teaching. So the first thing that you will do is you select 4 to 10 items that you want the student to learn, and you will set a fluency aim rate. This is the pre-teaching phase. Now you can set a fluency aim rate by looking at the provisional aim rate, or you can test the student on something equivalent that you know that they're fluent at, and you can then find out if they're fluent at that. Okay. The second step is you teach the same 4 to 10 items every day in 2 to 8 minute slots. Okay, you don't teach anything else other than the learning items that you have identified that they need to learn. Okay, it's got to be regular. Step 3, after each teaching session, you assess the student's fluency using the probe grid. The assessment lasts 1 minute. You tick what they can read or spell correctly, and record what they have done incorrectly. After assessing fluency after a few sessions, say 3 sessions, you track student progress on a chart. That's the tracking phase, and you will use acceleration chart to do this. And you continue teaching the same items until fluency has been achieved, and then you set new targets. Okay. Now, there's a possible problem now. You've done all of these things. So you've selected the targets, you have taught them, and you have gone through using the probe sheet and the grid. But here we have an example. Rosie has had precision teaching interventions for 5 weeks, but she has still not reached the fluency aim rate after 5 weeks. So we would expect someone to reach the fluency aim rate after 4 weeks. So what could be the reason for that? Now, there's a number of issues that could have occurred. Firstly, the learning targets are not cumulative. And I'm going to explain a little bit more what I mean by that. The second thing is that there are too many items to learn. So as I mentioned before, if you've set them 8 targets, maybe that's too many. So reduce that down and focus on a smaller number. So looking at number 1, the learning targets are not cumulative. Now, when you start precision teaching, you may be about to teach a student that you're very familiar with. So you know the student well, and you are aware already of what their specific weaknesses are. And so you can plan and select targets according to that. If you don't know that student, then you don't necessarily know what their particular targets are. And it's important, therefore, that we carry out a baseline assessment so that you can teach in a cumulative way. And what that word means, cumulative, is that you teach the easiest items that they need to learn first. So there's no point teaching a student to spell complicated polysyllabic words if they're still not fluent at identifying phase 2 letter sounds, for example. So a baseline assessment will give you the necessary information to be able to identify what the student's targets should be and to initiate the learning program according to that. Now, a baseline assessment can be anything, really. I mean, if you have recognized that a student has insecure phonological knowledge and you don't know yet how secure or what it is that they're insecure on, you can conduct a fake words test, for example. If you recognize that they can't read certain high frequency words, so give them a list of high frequency words and you can see how many they read correctly. If it's spelling, for example, it could be something like a simple spelling test. So a baseline test of phoneme, grapheme correspondence could be something like this. In the fake words, a grid with fake words, you can see that it's structured. So we're starting with the very simplest information. We've got simple letter sounds, and that moves on to words that are CV, CC, so that's consonant, vowel, consonant, consonant, and then you move on. So you can use phonics phases as a way to structure the grid, if you like. And right here at the bottom, you have much more complicated spelling patterns that students might learn from year 2 onwards. So that could be one way of seeing what they are weak on. Or a simple spelling test, high frequency words, what can they do correctly, what is it that they can't read correctly, and you will use this as the baseline assessment for your learning targets. Now, we've spoken a lot about the steps of precision teaching and the learning principles that underpin precision teaching, but so far we haven't looked at teaching. What are examples of good practice in the actual teaching itself? We know that the teaching sessions have to be very short. And we know that you are focusing on very specific items. But even so, there are certain principles that we should bear in mind. The first principle to bear in mind, as I've mentioned before, this word cumulative. Learning needs to be cumulative. So when a student is learning, it's important that they acquire the foundational knowledge first, and you build on that knowledge gradually. You're building up on knowledge. So that's why it's very important to do a baseline assessment if you don't know the student, so that they can you can identify the simplest things that they're not fluent at yet. Frequent repetition and rehearsal. Now, a core element of precision teaching is frequent repetition and rehearsal to ensure fluency. Third, and very important, are multi-sensory teaching methods. So in order to retain learning, it's very useful if all the sensory pathways are activated. That's the easiest way to ensure that learning is retained. So students are looking at things. They may be using tactile learning like magnetic letters. They may be writing, whatever it is, to make it as multisensory as possible. Structured, well, the nature of precision teaching is structured, but it goes back to this idea of cumulative learning and building up on foundational learning. And most important, I think, is to remember to keep it interesting. So even though you're having a lot of repetition of the same items, or because you're having a lot of repetition of the same learning, it's important that you vary the teaching methods that you use so they're not repetitive. So if you're teaching something, you've introduced them to those items, you can adapt or alter the teaching methods each session. So use games, use flashcards. I've repeated games twice there. Anything to keep it interesting and fun for them. Okay, so to summarise, I've got 3 questions, and those questions are really what I would hope that you can or feel that you can answer. So what are the key steps of precision teaching? How do you decide what is a suitable aim rate for your student? Okay, so, and the third question, and this is something quite important, how many consecutive days does the student need to meet the aim rate before you can move on to the next target? Okay, so just to give you a clue on that one, if they've reached the aim rate, okay, in one session, that does not necessarily mean that you now move on to new targets. So how many do they need to, how many times do they need to meet the fluency aim rate before you know they've reached fluency? So I'll give you about 30 seconds to think about that. Okay, so the steps of precision teaching, the key steps, there are 5 key steps, and if you go to the SENDsuccess website and the resources page, you will find an introductory pack there which will highlight the key steps and explain them fully. How do you decide what is a suitable aim rate? Again, you can use the provisional aim rate guideline, or you can personalise it by testing the student using a probe on something they're already fluent at. And finally, how many consecutive, the key is consecutive days, does the student need to meet the aim rate before you can move on? 3. You need to meet the aim rate 3 times before they are fluent enough to move on to new targets. So that's the end of our session today. If there's any further information that you'd like, please refer to the introductory guide on the SENDsuccess resources page. And thank you. Goodbye.